In this video, I'm going to discuss 150 more problems with the conviction of Lucy Letby. This is a continuation of the previous video that I recorded a few days ago, in which I went over an initial 150 problems. This video will therefore begin with problem 151. So let's get started. 151. The previous video concluded by talking about the insulin cases that were critical in the conviction of Lucy Letby. In Private Eye, Dr. Philip Hammond has noted that reports submitted recently by the expert panel that has been convened by Dr. Xu Li are considerably weightier and more convincing than the original insulin reports. 152. Countless medical errors were discounted and never mentioned in the court case, far more than can reasonably be discussed here. 153. Among these was a serious blunder by Dr. Stephen Breary when aspirating child O, in which he damaged the liver of the infant with a needle. It is clear that Breary engaged in the wrong medical procedure at this time. 154. Claims regarding the pathologist are odd, as two pathologists cited a subcapsular hematoma as being critical in the case of child O, and then that was completely discounted by Dr. Evans during the court process. 155. The prosecution case for child O also requires Lucy Letby to have punched the infant in the liver, according to Dewi Evans, a claim which is both preposterous and unevidenced. 156. This is similar to the case of child E, for which Dewi Evans claimed that Lucy Letby used an indeterminate tool to damage an infant that had very obviously suffered a gastrointestinal hemorrhage, again without any evidence. 157. The problems with sewage on the unit were mentioned during the court case, but the consequences of this were never properly examined or explained to the jury, in particular the link between sewage, sepsis and Pseudomonas. 158. Hospital staff repeatedly appeared as experts in the court case, but their testimony was misleading as they were often unaware of their own blunders and lack of knowledge. 159. In fact, much of the court case consists of staff from the hospital stating that they had no idea what was going on, which is indeed very evident from the litany of problems and errors on the unit. 160. There was a constant pattern throughout the court case, and indeed events at the Countess of Chester, of testing being required for various reasons and none being carried out. 161. The court didn't hear about the failure of the Countess of Chester to meet the British Association of Perinatal Medicine standards for various aspects of operations on the unit. The hospital and its staff were well aware of this. 162. The court didn't hear about the Care Quality Commission criticism of the neonatal unit. 163. It was never explained to the court or jury that there was no neonatologist on the unit at the Countess of Chester, while its advanced neonatal nurse practitioner position was removed, and there were numerous other staffing issues. 164. In fact, prosecuting barrister Nick Johnson invested considerable time and effort in attempting to reject the significance of any staffing issues with regard to the outcome of infants. This was a central argument of his closing statement in court. 165. The court did not hear about the inadequate number of ward rounds conducted at the Countess of Chester, which occurred twice weekly instead of the twice daily that is generally recommended. This has been roundly criticised by both doctors and nurses. 166. The court didn't hear about the instances of elevated stillbirths that occurred at the Countess of Chester at the same time as problems on the neonatal unit. 167. The repeated transferring of infants within the Northwest Neonatal Network was never properly contextualised in the court case. Some infants were transferred multiple times, even though this was clearly inappropriate and acknowledged as such by Dr. Stephen Breary and other staff at the Countess of Chester. 168. The lack of skills and poor monitoring on the neonatal unit means that incidents can be missed or even not adequately understood. This means that the court received an entirely false impression of what occurred on the neonatal unit, as we now know from the International Panel of Experts. 169. Child C did not see a consultant until the third day of his life, despite being in a perilous state. This was symptomatic of blunders and inattentiveness on the unit. 170. Many infants being treated at the Countess of Chester were tiny and hugely premature. They were therefore particularly vulnerable, and the general medical consensus is that several of these infants should have been treated on a level 3 neonatal unit. 171. Even recently, a report on the Countess of Chester has once again been damning, even with regard to the ability of the hospital to deal with sepsis, which has now been dragging on for at least 10 years. 172. Insufficient testing was done on the unit. One obvious example of this is in relation to Stenotrophomonas multifilia. The statement from Thirlwell lawyers claims that this condition was ruled out by testing, but this claim is frankly completely wrong. Ruling out Stenotrophomonas multifilia requires specific testing, and this simply wasn't conducted. 173. The assertion from lawyers is based on the testimony of Dr. Evans, but he also ruled out sepsis, which was virtually endemic on the unit. We also know that Evans specifically told Cheshire Police that an expert in infection would not be necessary. 174. One of the many errors from the hospital was the failure to retain feeding bags in relation to the allegedly insulin-poisoned Child F and Child L. A document from the Thirlwell inquiry indicates that the hospital retained bags for another infant, but chose not to do so for the insulin cases. Had they done so, that would likely have exonerated Lucy Letby immediately. 175. There were too many medical errors on the unit to discuss in this video, but one that must be mentioned is the failure to conduct a blood transfusion despite Child E losing at least 25% of his blood supply and probably more than 25%. 176. Various parents were advised by the Countess of Chester against having postmortems for their infants when they definitely should have been advised to have postmortems. 177. There are several cases, particularly Child D, in which the parents would have a strong case for medical negligence against the hospital due to very obvious mistakes that have been made. 178. Indeed, the parents of Child D had already begun such proceedings before the investigation of Lucy Letby commenced. 179. The prosecution made numerous unfounded and unsupported assertions during the trial. One such example was when prosecutor Nick Johnson told the court that the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, that Lucy Letby had a fascination with the babies she had murdered and attempted to murder, and with their families she took pleasure in her murderous handiwork. Far from being the truth, there is literally no evidence for this. 180. The court was also subjected to all manner of embarrassing cross-examination. One such example was when Nick Johnson asked Lucy Letby whether she disputed being born. 181. The case of Child E requires Lucy to hang around for an hour doing nothing while a child bleeds to death. This seems phenomenally unlikely to the point of being completely implausible. 182. Lucy raised alarms on numerous occasions in the court case in order to draw attention to infants that had collapsed or were suffering. Lucy is often punished for being the most alert and conscientious person on the unit, and frequently for simply being the first responder to incidents. 183. Indeed, the prosecution tried to use Lucy being the first responder to alarms against her in the court case. 184. A telephone log used in the case of Child E is likely incorrect, as the prosecution case related to these timings makes absolutely no sense. 185. The swipe card data from the court case was reversed for 9 infants, rendering it completely worthless almost immediately. 186. The prosecution contradicted its own swipe card data in court when Nick Johnson, the prosecuting barrister, conceded that it was possible for anyone to sneak in behind anyone else at any time without swiping, therefore rendering the entire data set completely worthless. This was one statement that Nick Johnson made, which is absolutely correct. Unfortunately, it torpedoes large parts of the prosecution case. 187. If there weren't enough reasons to doubt the swipe card data already, a staircase from the nursery had no swipe card exit, meaning that all of the data used in court can give a completely misleading impression regarding the whereabouts of various members of staff. 188. Advanced neonatal nurse practitioner Michelle Warden also pointed out to me recently that parents could easily be present at numerous occasions during the court case, because they don't have swipe cards and could have followed nurses or doctors into units and nurseries. This was never noted during the court case. 189. There are countless examples of Lucy Letby being accused of deliberately harming infants at times when she wasn't the designated nurse for a baby. Sometimes acts of caring and attention were held against her, and at other times Lucy simply became guilty by virtue of being on duty. 190. Lucy Letby also wasn't present when child F was allegedly poisoned by her, but this infant still appears in the shift chart. 191. Numerous infant collapses were excluded from the court case. The jury simply never heard about them. 192. We know that Dewi Evans had cited some of these collapses initially before mysteriously shifting attention to other collapses. 193. As mentioned previously, the most egregious example of this is child C, where Evans changed the day that was considered critical during the court case due to Lucy Letby not being on duty. 194. Many of the most rapid deteriorations occurred when Lucy Letby was not on duty. This has been confirmed by a shift chart compiled by the publication Unheard, which relied on a shift chart provided by Dr. Dewi Evans himself. It's not entirely clear why Dr. Dewi Evans had a shift chart in the first place. 195. Even when Lucy is present for collapses, there are several incidents where carrying out any malicious acts that are alleged is completely unthinkable due to the presence of other staff. 196. Considering these various factors, the logistics of these attacks are implausible to the point of impossibility. The neonatal unit at the County Chester was cramped, and people were moving around on a regular basis. The level of risk required in one attack is significant, but the scale and scope of attacks alleged, without detection or suspicion from anyone on the unit, is frankly utterly ridiculous. 197. One example of this is the case for child P, in which the prosecution case involves 3 witnesses being present at the same time as Lucy supposedly attacking the infant. The prosecution also moved collapses around, causing Ben Myers to compare the prosecution to a game of chess, with check, 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 moving around. It's not the night before. Okay, now it's the night before. 198. Several assertions related to the internal Datix record system were literally fabricated by the prosecution. All evidence points to Lucy Letby being the most conscientious compiler of Datix information on the unit. 199. Indeed, every instance in the prosecution case in which Lucy Letby is accused of altering documents is fabricated. There is no evidence to support these assertions, literally none. 200. One assertion from the Court of Appeal is that Lucy appeared to be fixated with being involved in events in the intensive care nursery and involved herself unnecessarily with babies who had been designated to other nurses. One could rather describe this as a responsible attitude and natural degree of concern from someone who had been prematurely thrust into a position of seniority on the unit. It is simply Lucy's job to respond to alarms, particularly in Nursery 1, intended for the most vulnerable infants. 201. Character witnesses who were willing to speak in favour of Lucy Letby were advised not to appear in court. 202. The judge from a previous case in which lead prosecution witness Dr. Dewi Evans appeared wrote to Letby trial judge James Goss stating that the evidence that Evans had provided in the previous case was worthless and that he had made no effort to give a balanced opinion. 203. Dewi Evans should have been thrown out of this court case immediately, as such an intervention by a judge is pretty much unprecedented. However, for some unknown reason, he was allowed to continue in the court case. 204. There was an extraordinary exchange between Lucy Letby and prosecuting barrister Nick Johnson, in which the latter became fixated on whether or not Lucy Letby owned a shredder. This was symptomatic of the quality of evidence presented in the court case. 205. It has been conceded by both the prosecution and police that Lucy Letby could have used this shredder to shred all of the so-called anecdotal evidence. The reason that Lucy Letby didn't do this is that she didn't consider it to be significant, as she indeed stated during police interviews. 206. In court, Nick Johnson attempted to make capital from whether or not Lucy Letby was wearing pyjamas when she was arrested. Johnson attempted to suggest that Lucy was lying when further investigation indicates that her comments were perfectly reasonable, as she was wearing nightwear when she was arrested. 207. The pyjamas were hardly the most important aspect of Lucy's testimony, which was focused on how harrowing being arrested was. Johnson was selecting something of no consequence in a pretty despicable attempt to discredit the witness. 208. We now know that the prosecution misled the court thanks to a Netflix documentary which indicated that Lucy Letby was wearing nightwear when arrested and was even arrested in bed. 209. A third and particularly reprehensible example came when Johnson rather forcefully questioned Lucy Letby on a text message related to the phrase "going commando." This seemed to be a rather gratuitous and somewhat misogynistic aspect of his cross-examination. 210. Another farcical moment in the court case came when prosecutor Nick Johnson accused Lucy Letby of keeping a paper towel as a trophy. 211. The prosecution also fabricated the suggestion that Lucy Letby fished the paper towel out of a confidential waste bin, even though this was completely unsupported by evidence. Many healthcare professionals have also since suggested that this is essentially impossible. 212. The prosecution then alleged that Lucy had kept this paper towel as a trophy, even though it was found discarded in a Morrison's carrier bag underneath her bed and was clearly not treasured. 213. Numerous assertions made by the prosecution are categorically untrue. All manner of hypothetical assertions related to Lucy Letby's whereabouts and various incidents on the unit were literally entirely fabricated by the prosecution without evidence, let alone proof. 214. One such incident involves Nick Johnson stating that the mother of child E had caught Lucy Letby red-handed. It is agreed evidence that no one saw Lucy Letby doing anything wrong, so this was provably untrue and simply a lie. 215. Judge James Goss ruled that the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health report on the Countess of Chester, which was highly critical of the Countess of Chester neonatal unit, should not be allowed in the court case as evidence. 216. This is incomprehensible, as many medical experts have cited information in this report as being critically important. 217. Instructions from Judge James Goss enabled jurors to view Lucy Letby as guilty if they concluded that she had acted with murderous intent. There was no requirement for the jury to be certain regarding the method of murder, lowering the requirements of reasonable doubt. 218. Similarly, Judge Goss allowed a majority verdict. It is known that majority verdicts are more readily associated with miscarriages of justice. 219. During the court case, the lead prosecution witness, Dr. Dewi Evans, overruled pathology reports filed by Dr. Jane Horden and a second raft of pathology reports that examined the infants at the times of their death. 220. Coroners also examined the infants, and yet this was all struck out during the court case in favour of some arcane theories from a retired paediatrician who hasn't worked in a hospital for nearly 20 years. 221. Indeed, there is barely any mention of pathology reports or coroner verdicts during the court case, and when they are mentioned, they are brushed over almost immediately. 222. Lucy's grievance procedure with the Countess of Chester Hospital was mentioned, but the court and jury were not informed that Dr. Stephen Breary, who gave evidence against Lucy Letby during the court case, was the instigator of action taken to remove Lucy from the neonatal unit. 223. nor were the jury told the outcome of the grievance procedure, which was that all 7 points were upheld. Consultants on the unit were forced to apologise to Lucy for their conduct after an extensive independent investigation, but the court never heard of this. 224. The court did not hear about the campaign of Dr. Stephen Breary and Dr. Ravi Jairam, both of whom gave evidence in the court case, to remove Lucy Letby from the neonatal unit. 225. Nor did they hear that Dr. Stephen Breary located the insulin cases, and that both Breary and Jairam have been involved in the selection of cases for the court case itself. 226. This is important because Dr. Stephen Breary located the insulin cases which were central to the prosecution, and both Breary and Jairam had been involved in the selection of cases for the court case. This seems deeply inappropriate considering that both Dr. Jairam and primarily Dr. Breary literally ran a campaign to have Lucy Letby ejected from the neonatal unit, becoming practically fixated with this. 227. There were 18 deaths associated with the neonatal unit over this period, and the vast majority of these infants died at the Countess of Chester Hospital. The police investigated 17 of these 18 deaths, and the vast majority were excluded from the court case. This was never mentioned to the jury. 228. For some reason, the police never investigated one of the deaths of an infant born on the neonatal unit, which passed away on the central labour suite at the Countess of Chester Hospital. A likely explanation is that this couldn't be pinned on Lucy Letby. 229. The jury never heard that 3 full-term infants born between 39 and 40-week gestation died during this period, which was already equal to the Countess of Chester performance in previous years. This doesn't require any malignant behaviour from Lucy Letby, and when infants died at other hospitals are taken into consideration as well, this in fact exceeds the figure of previous years and would create a spike in itself. 230. The jury never heard about the tragic case of Noah Robinson, who had died at the Countess of Chester due to medical blunders from doctors who gave evidence during the court case. 231. Similarly, the jury in court heard nothing about errors made in the tragic case of Ollie Stopforth. 232. An enormous amount of time was devoted to eyewitness accounts from parents and other relatives during the court case. However, these accounts essentially revealed nothing, as no one has seen Lucy Letby do anything untoward. 233. It is clear that these accounts were introduced in the court case purely in an attempt to emotionally sway the jury, which is both an underhand and inappropriate tactic, and also one that heightens the probability of a miscarriage of justice and unsafe conviction. When one reads through the closing statement of Nick Johnson, it is clear that he repeatedly relied on emotional arguments. 234. The court heard that Lucy Letby was removed from the neonatal unit, but it was indicated that this was due to suspicions among staff. Instead, it is now known, thanks to the Thirlwell inquiry, that Lucy Letby had been removed for her own protection. 235. Ian Harvey had informed pathologist Dr. Jane Horden in February 2017 that in citing the reduction in deaths after downgrading the unit, that the consultants were being selective and disingenuous in that there is no comparison between the intensity of the workload before and after the downgrade of the unit. Ian Harvey went on to say that we believe that they are trying to suggest that the only significant change has been reassigning the member of staff, which we did to protect that member. It should be noted that Dr. Breary would literally do exactly the same thing during the court case. 236. Throughout the court proceedings, the spike in deaths at the Countess of Chester was presented as an outlier. In fact, the Countess of Chester was one of 21 hospitals that were examined as part of the Mothers and Babies Reducing Risk through audits and confidential inquiries across the UK. 237. In accordance with this, several statisticians suggest that the spike in deaths was nothing out of the ordinary for the UK as a whole. 238. Furthermore, when conditions at the hospital are taken into consideration, the spike can become entirely explicable. 239. It has been suggested by several credible sources that the transferring of infants to the Countess of Chester from other hospitals in the northwest region is significant in the spike in deaths. Freedom of information requests seem to support this notion. 240. Infants from the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester died at other hospitals when Lucy Letby wasn't around, indicative of the problems that the Countess of Chester neonatal unit was experiencing at that time. 241. Numerous collapses from the indictment infants occurred in other hospitals. These were not included or mentioned during the court case. 242. In another incident in court, prosecutor Nick Johnson accused Lucy Letby of lying about being cut off and isolated from friends on the neonatal unit, but a statement submitted to the Thirlwell inquiry in February 2024 by nurse Claire Bevan confirmed the account of Lucy Letby to be accurate. Bevan stated plainly that neonatal staff were told not to have any contact with Lucy. 243. While Lucy Letby was expected to possess perfect recall of everything that ever occurred to her, those involved with the prosecution weren't quite so infallible. Dr. Dewi Evans made several mistakes of memory. Nick Johnson was forced to concede that he had accused Lucy Letby of lying in court, but was proved to be wrong, as he acknowledged himself, and the memory of Dr. Jairam was frankly all over the place. 244. Events were recalled incorrectly by the prosecution. Other recollections were inserted into the court case that we now know to be incorrect. The prosecution reversed swipe card data. They failed to account for a Sturt case that renders this data worthless. There were cases and collapses being shifted around in and out of the court case while relying on a shift chart that is categorically and fundamentally worthless. On reflection, it is fortunate that the prosecution didn't hold themselves to the same standard that they themselves required from Lucy Letby herself. 245. Accusations and insinuations were also made with regard to handover sheets that were taken home by Lucy Letby inadvertently. The prosecution claimed that Lucy treasured these handover sheets as trophies related to her supposed murders, but in reality the vast majority of them were nothing to do with the court case. 246. Furthermore, handover sheets were found in bin bags in Lucy Letby's garage and in a Morrison's carrier bag under her bed, contrary to the idea that they were treasured. 247. One specific handover sheet was found in a keepsake box with a rose. This treasured handover sheet related to Lucy's first ever shift on the unit and was unrelated to the court case, as this occurred in 2010, whereas the indictment period was 2015 to 2016. This wasn't an argument made by Lucy Letby or her defence. The rose and the keepsake box were raised by the prosecution in court, effectively torpedoing the logic of their own argument. 248. Cheshire Police claimed in the Netflix documentary that the confession notes were found in chronological order. This is very obviously untrue based on the fact that they weren't all discovered in one place. 249. In fact, Cheshire Police tried to suggest that many or most of the handover sheets were found in a box marked Keep during the Netflix documentary. This box, in fact, contained 5 handover sheets. 250. 236 handover sheets recovered from Lucy Letby's home were unrelated to the infants included in the indictment. This is not contentious nor contested. 251. However, it is less well known that 248 of the sheets are unrelated to the court case because only 9 were related to days when infants suffer collapses. This means that 97% of the sheets recovered were unrelated to the case. It therefore becomes very difficult to assert that these sheets were deliberately taken home by Lucy Letby for some nefarious reason, as this simply makes no sense. 252. Countless nurses have recounted to me that it is very easy to accidentally take home handover notes. Indeed, this is the precise explanation that Lucy Letby immediately gave to the police, having initially been confused why she was asked about this subject. 253. Finally, and most importantly, the handover sheets are completely unrelated to the allegations. They have no bearing whatsoever on whether or not there are any crimes at the Countess of Chester. They are, literally, irrelevant. 254. The so-called confession note cited by the prosecution quite clearly is not a confession note, not least because it contains many more statements, including the indication of trauma and innocence, than anything remotely approaching guilt. 255. The one statement that was used to infer guilt includes the phrase "not good enough," clearly indicating that Lucy Letby meant she was an inadequate nurse and this had led to the deaths. Lucy indeed repeated this "not good enough" phrase both in a text message displayed in court and during police interviews. It should also be noted that renowned Professor Gisli Gudjonsson has also endorsed this explanation. 256. It is also known that the so-called confession notes were written under the instruction of occupational health representative Catherine de Bager, encouraging Lucy to pour out her feelings. They were not an indicator of guilt, nor were they ever intended to be any form of confession. Catherine de Bager later wrote glowingly of Lucy in a document submitted to the Thirlwell inquiry. 257. There is a blue post-it note which has received minimal publicity that contains several exculpatory statements. These include the fact that Lucy states that there is obviously no evidence against her at a time that she never knew anyone else would ever see these notes or that the police would arrest her. This is a clear statement of innocence from someone who believes herself to be innocent. Why does she believe herself to be innocent? Because she knows that she's innocent. 258. Other notes recovered by Cheshire Police also indicate a traumatised woman and contain no information pointing to guilt. 259. Lucy's diary was cited as containing relevant information related to the supposed murders. Indeed, many people still wrongly believe that Lucy confessed to murder in her diary. However, in reality, there is nothing of substance in this diary whatsoever. It consists of entirely mundane information. There was also supposed to be some sort of code that then runs through her messaging and other anecdotal materials collected by the police, but this was completely without foundation and frankly an utterly ludicrous suggestion. 260. Indeed, Cheshire Police never gave any meaningful details regarding this code, and the references that they have made to content in the diary have been confirmed by many nurses to be flatly incorrect. 261. Despite this, the diary was cited in a recent Netflix documentary with absurd assertions made by Cheshire Police officers. Lucy was even asked about asterisks in the diary during police interviews. 262. Speaking of police interviews, Lucy Letby endured 23 hours of interviewing by the police. She answered an inordinate number of questions, all with constructive and non-evasive answers. Even Cheshire Police conceded that she was unusually cooperative. 263. In the recent Netflix documentary, it was implied that Lucy Letby answered no comment to important questions on a regular basis. This was deceitful, as the police know very well that Lucy barely ever stated that she would make no comment. We know this from the many hours of police interview transcripts that are now readily available. She had also answered the questions depicted in the documentary on more than one previous occasion. 264. Facebook searches made by Lucy Letby were also used in court as evidence, but these were essentially meaningless. 99% of them were completely unrelated to the case. 266. Text messages recovered from Lucy Letby's mobile phone contained no valid or useful information whatsoever. Even the police conceded that the content was remarkably normal. 267. There was no evidence recovered of Lucy Letby having searched for any murder methods or anything related to murder. Indeed, as mentioned previously, there is no indication of any macabre interest in Lucy Letby, quite the opposite. Lucy's about as squeaky clean as it's possible to be. 268. Lucy Letby provided the police with extremely lengthy and indeed likely explanations for all anecdotal evidence, but in their wisdom, Cheshire Police completely ignored these explanations. 269. In the 2024 retrial of Child K, there was literally no meaningful evidence provided whatsoever. This conviction is entirely reliant on the eyewitness testimony of Dr. Ravi Jairam, which will be assessed imminently. 270. Judge James Goss informed the jury that they shouldn't make assumptions based on Letby's previous convictions and that they were to assess the case on its own merits, purely based on the evidence presented in court. But the prosecution was then allowed to reference the convictions continually throughout the court case and without objection. 271. The jury for the retrial was expected to forget this, while also being repeatedly reminded of it, but were denied the right to read the New Yorker article by Rachel Aviv that is frequently referenced by people who have followed the case. Apparently, Rachel Aviv's work could have unfairly influenced the court proceedings. 272. Analysis of the records related to the neonatal unit indicate that it is likely Dr. Jayram saw nurse Caroline Oakley near an incubator, not Lucy Letby. This would make sense considering the shift patterns and what we know about movements on the unit. 273. During the retrial of Child K, the prosecution invented the new concept of catching someone virtually red-handed, a ridiculous notion which is literally physically impossible. You either catch someone red-handed or you don't catch them red-handed at all. You cannot catch them virtually red-handed. 274. The phrase standing over was used during the retrial and also at other points during the court case to give a sinister impression of the actions of Lucy Letby. However, what Lucy was actually doing was observing infants, which is not only perfectly reasonable, but absolutely the correct thing for a neonatal nurse to do. 275. In fact, Lucy Letby was following standard procedure for the neonatal unit, which had been disseminated to her during training. Indeed, what else could she reasonably be expected to do? 276. Indeed, Dr. Jayram himself had even given this precise explanation on how nurses should behave to parents just 1 week before this supposed incident. 277. It is also important to note that Child K was not Lucy's designated infant. She was in fact responding to an alarm in the only rational and professional way possible, if indeed she was in the room at all. 278. It hasn't been satisfactorily established that the breathing tube related to the Child K allegations was even dislodged at the time, never mind that it was dislodged deliberately, and certainly not the identity of the alleged person who had supposedly dislodged it. 279. Endotracheal tubes can become detached accidentally. There are, in fact, endless resources online regarding what to do in such instances, and countless academic studies written about this. 280. Dr. Jayram had told Dr. Christopher Green during an interview that formed part of Lucy Letby's grievance procedure that there is no objective evidence at all to suggest that Lucy had harmed babies, and that the only concern raised about Lucy was that she had been exposed to so many deaths and this might be traumatic for her. Dr. Jayram also told Green on the 11th of November 2016 that the only concerns raised were that we had a statistically significant rise in unexplained deaths and near misses, and we didn't know why. While we know that Ravi doesn't exactly have the most sparkling memory, it does seem to have slipped his mind at this point that he's supposed to have seen Lucy Letby attempting to murder a baby. 281. Jayram also didn't mention this in any of the review meetings or any of the deep dive discussions. He didn't mention it when the Royal College came to do their investigation. He didn't say anything to the Care Quality Commission. He failed to mention any of this for well over a year, and then he finally managed to remember this incident when meeting with Nigel Wenham of Cheshire Police on the 15th of May 2017, some 453 days after it supposedly happened. 282. A new leaked email makes it clear that Dr. Jayram gave a different account previously to the one that he relied on in court. 283. With this in mind, Sir David Davis has written to Cheshire Police asking them to investigate Dr. Jayram for perjury. 284. Lucy Letby was originally to have been charged with murder over Child K. It was only at the 11th hour during a hearing held at Manchester Crown Court on the 10th of June 2022 that the prosecution dropped its intention to accuse Letby of murdering Child K an infant that died in another hospital 18 miles away from Chester, 3 days after Lucy had allegedly had contact with the baby, and even this wasn't satisfactorily established. Yet she was to be accused of murdering this infant. 285. In summary, the conviction of Child K relies on an uncorroborated eyewitness account that is flawed evidence in the first place, emanating from someone who has changed his testimony at least 3 times, and who quite evidently has a particularly unreliable memory regarding an event about which the oxymoronically absurd suggestion was that he'd caught Lucy Letby virtually red-handed, about an incident for which there are far more plausible explanations, with no other supporting evidence whatsoever, for which it is doubtful that Lucy Letby was even in the room when the incident was supposedly observed, and about which Dr. J-Ram had explicitly given a completely different and documented account previously. 286. In the recent Netflix documentary, officers from Cheshire Police make a series of ridiculous statements, with possibly the most egregious of these, because it is flatly wrong procedurally and legally, being that they were forced to arrest Lucy Letby. This is simply known to be untrue. 287. The Cheshire Police investigation of the situation at the Countess of Chester was incredibly inept. One of the many problems with the investigation was the persistent flaunting of basic policy and procedure, as has been outlined by Dr. Steve Watts, former police investigator and author of Official Manuals on Murder Investigations. 288. Senior Coroner's Officer Stephanie Davies has become a critic of the police investigation, and we now know that the police misinterpreted her comments on there being missing jigsaw pieces. 289. It was mentioned earlier that Dr. Stephen Breary located the insulin cases. Cheshire Police told both the Observer and Vanity Fair of this. However, Dr. Dewi Evans has also claimed to have located the insulin cases, and this was even stated in court and is repeated in the Court of Appeal verdict. 290. Cheshire Police bundled together numerous similar cases and submitted them to the Crown Prosecution Service. Naturally, Lucy Letby was to be prosecuted on these cases. They were summarily rejected by the Crown Prosecution Service, which indicated that they didn't meet the evidential standards required. It is believed that a major factor in this was the fact that the Crown Prosecution Service recognised that the defence team for Lucy Letby now is so strong that the prosecution would inevitably be annihilated, and a litany of problems with the original conviction would also be aired. 291. As the embarrassingly inept nature of the investigation has become more obvious, Cheshire Police have increasingly receded into hiding. Indeed, the constabulary has not posted on its Twitter account since December the 8th, 2024. 292. The Thirlwell inquiry has been far from transparent with the publication of its documents. We've already mentioned the third insulin case and the document that was permanently removed from the Thirlwell website. Other documents have similarly not been published despite being submitted to the Thirlwell inquiry, while Thirlwell has omitted multiple pages in hundreds and possibly thousands of documents. 293. Again, such has been the shambolic nature of the Thirlwell inquiry that the public inquiry has now become too scared to continue, finding it impossible to meet its own purported deadlines, which have been pushed back further and further. 294. Stephanie Davies, who now believes that the Lucy Letby case is a miscarriage of justice, has requested for her statement to Thirlwell to be amended, but has never heard back from the inquiry. 295. The bottom line with the Lucy Letby case is that nothing involved with it makes any sense. It doesn't make any sense for Lucy Letby to commit these crimes. There is no motive. The mechanisms are phenomenally unlikely. The logistics are impossible. The evidence is poor. There are obvious alternative explanations available for the infants. Everything in the prosecution case is falling apart, and this is reflected in the remaining few points of this video. 296. In the 2.5 years since the conviction of Lucy Letby, there hasn't been a single expert who has come forward to support any aspect of the prosecution. 297. By contrast, there are now 31 experts working in defence of Lucy Letby. I have personally interviewed dozens of experts on this channel. I have interviewed many more experts for my book. I am in contact with dozens of other doctors and professors. There are nearly 1,000 experts now as part of the 19 Nurses organisation. Sir David Davis, Sir Jeremy Hunt, Lord Jonathan Sumption, and there are many, many others who have also spoken out. More doctors and professors across multiple specialisms are coming forward all the time, all of them doing this because they recognise the importance of this issue. 298. Compare this to the 0 people that have come forward to support the claims made by Dr. Dewi Evans. Dr. Philip Hammond recently challenged Evans on this yet again, and Evans suggested someone who would conceivably support him, and the person declined to do so. We are still awaiting anyone with medical qualifications who wishes to support either Dr. Dewi Evans or the prosecution. 299. Dr. Evans has contradicted himself so many times in his public comments by this point, it has become practically surreal. His fellow prosecution witness, Dr. Sandy Bowen, has practically gone into hiding after being widely criticised by residents of the island of Guernsey. Professor Peter Hindmarsh has become a highly compromised character, and the evidence that he gave was highly dubious in court in the first place. And pathologist Dr. Andreas Manarides certainly has some very serious questions to answer. 300. The reason for this deficit between those willing to support Lucy Letby and the literally 0 people willing to support the prosecution is quite obvious. The infants in this case have very obvious clinical signs, and anyone who supported the prosecution would be torpedoing their own career and reputation immediately. Child C is a very obvious bowel obstruction. Child D died due to infection, pneumonia, poor care, and a delay in antibiotics. Child E is a blindingly obvious gastrointestinal hemorrhage. Child F and Child L are cases of naturally occurring hypoglycemia. Allegations were made with regard to the overfeeding of milk, which are embarrassingly ridiculous in the case of Child G. Evans couldn't even come up with remotely plausible mechanisms for Child H and Child J, and the former very obviously involves mismanagement of a collapsed lung. Child I is very obviously suffering with infection. There is no evidence whatsoever provided for Child K. The evidence put in court for Child M, provided by Dr. Sandy Bowen, based on a second-hand account of something a parent said about their infant screaming for 30 minutes, is utterly laughable and wouldn't be supported by anyone with any medical qualifications anywhere in the world. Finally, it is clear that there was serious medical mismanagement in the case of Child O, and again explanations given in court by Dr. Evans bordered on the farcical. Child O was suffering with a subcapsular hematoma, as also applied to Child P. That is why this case is falling apart and crumbling, because the evidence used in court has 0 credibility. This is obvious anyway, but as we continue to examine the court transcripts, it becomes clear that the prosecution case is based on misdirection, fabrication, ridiculous arguments, medical evidence that is extremely poor, and in some instances, outright lying. We have now investigated 300 problems with the conviction of Lucy Letby. We have seen that there are serious systemic problems on the ward, staffing shortages, poor monitoring, inadequate consultant input, and failures to meet professional standards at the Countess of Chester Hospital neonatal unit. Everything from sewage and infection control to missed tests, including specialised tests for such organisms as Stenotrophomonas. Inconsistent retention of clinical items, for example feeding bags, also ironically boosted the prosecution case. These problems alone offer much more plausible explanations for many infant deteriorations than deliberate harm. There are furthermore serious weaknesses in the prosecution case. There are many examples where evidence relied on by the Crown was unreliable or contradicted by contemporaneous records. Reversed and inaccurate swipe card logs, contested and even fabricated datex entries, shift charts that were later shown to be inaccurate, and highly questionable interpretations of pathology all contribute to what is a seriously unsafe conviction. The prosecution's narrative rests on anecdote and presumption, emotionally charged courtroom presentation, and the dismal evidence and conduct of Dr. Dewi Evans. If Evans is now a discredited witness, other so-called expert witnesses are equally compromised. In fact, it is quite extraordinary that the prosecution somehow managed to rely on Evans, Bohin, Hindmarsh, and previously wanted to include Ward Platt, who had already presided over 2 miscarriages of justice related to accusations of murder. Furthermore, many potentially exculpatory facts, grievance outcomes, Care Quality Commission and Royal College criticisms, multiple transfers in the regional network, other mistakes on the neonatal unit were not put before jurors or were excluded by judicial ruling. It couldn't be clearer now that the presentation of infants' conditions and well-being in court was simply completely wrong. These were vulnerable, often extremely ill babies, and none of them were stable. Those who were most sick were at constant risk of collapse, and even Dr. Evans acknowledged this in his notes for Child C. There are very clear explanations available now for the collapse of these infants provided by much more qualified medics, and which are obviously consistent with the clinical signs of the infants. It is idiocy to think that the arcane nonsense of Dr. Evans provides more likely clinical explanations. This case also involves enormous investigative and evidential failures beyond the neonatal ward. Cheshire Police are guilty of procedural missteps and misrepresenting material to the general public. There are obvious inconsistencies, problems and issues with material that's been released by Cheshire Police, such as handover notes, diary entries and so-called confession notes. The public inquiry tasked with investigating the Counts of Chester, the Thirlwall inquiry, has omitted documents, ignored reams of critical evidence in its public process, and delayed publication of its conclusions, leaving a catalogue of questions about its legitimacy. The 300 problems that I have presented across these 2 videos are not an exhaustive documentation of the issues with the conviction of Lucy Letby. It is almost impossible to document this exhaustively, and I can only attempt to do this via this channel and my forthcoming book. Occasionally someone will suggest to me that I'm not willing to speak with anyone who believes in guilt. In fact, I've made numerous requests for anyone who believes Lucy Letby is guilty to contact me, and so at this point I will make this request again. You can email me at lucy_letby_analysis@mail.com if you believe that Lucy Letby is guilty, and I'm perfectly happy to have you on the channel. Please feel free to come on camera and I will interview. At the time of recording this video, I've received over 1,000 emails from nurses, from statisticians, from doctors, from professors, from other healthcare professionals, all of whom believe this is an unsafe conviction, most of whom believe definitively that Lucy Letby is innocent, and none of whom believe that Lucy Letby is guilty beyond reasonable doubt. I haven't had a single email from anyone who believes that Lucy Letby is guilty, despite repeated requests for such an email. Dr. Philip Hammond of Private Eye similarly has not had a single person come forward to support the prosecution. And I know that this latest request will result in no one emailing me, because there are only 3 groups of people who could possibly believe that Lucy Letby is guilty. The first of these is someone who knows nothing about the case. If you don't know anything about the case, fair enough, please do take the time to watch the videos here, read Private Eye, and make sure you understand that this is an egregious miscarriage of justice, and also that this could easily happen to you. That is the bottom line message that I want people to understand. This isn't about Lucy Letby, this is about the fact that this could happen to me, you, or anyone. Anyone that is familiar with the details of the case and claims that Lucy Letby is guilty must either have a vested interest or be an imbecile. It is worth reiterating that the level of reasonable doubt required for a conviction of this magnitude should be approximately 5% at the most. To say that this conviction has been proven with a certainty in excess of 95% is frankly utterly laughable. Only the brain-dead, credulous or chronically biased could possibly believe this, which is why no serious person with any credibility has come forward to claim this since the conviction, and why there are hundreds of credentialed people coming forward to decry this debacle now. It is blindingly, mind-numbingly obvious that this is a miscarriage of justice and that Lucy Letby is innocent. If you still believe otherwise, you either need to educate yourself or have a quiet word with yourself. I must reiterate once again, this can easily happen to you. This could happen to anyone who is watching this video. There are already an estimated 2,000 to 10,000 innocent people in prison, according to research that was presented at a recent parliamentary meeting. Based on my examination of this court case, I strongly suspect that figure is much closer to 10,000 than 2,000. Please don't labour under the delusion that you would be somehow guaranteed a fair trial, that you are somehow special. You could very easily find yourself being one of those 10,000 people.